It's been a minute since I did a good old-fashioned video essay, and I wanted to do one for Pride Month, specifically talking about queer characters in media, and more specifically, to talk about how and why characters that might not be explicitly queer still get claimed as such, and why that's often an entirely valid way to interpret art. But before I do that, I want to talk about another piece of queer-led art. I have been doing YouTube full-time now for a whole year, and in that time, I've yet to do any ad spots because I hadn't been approached with a project I felt comfortable sharing with my audience. Which is why I'm proud to bring you Stardust, a queer-led sci-fi multimedia project that is on Kickstarter right now from Sublight Games, an independent studio founded and led by trans women. The Kickstarter for Stardust includes a novel-length prequel written by Faith K. Faulkner and an accompanying audiobook featuring a full voice cast and an audio drama with original music and sound effects, all leading into a full tabletop gaming experience. I have read through the Kickstarter myself, and it is one of the most comprehensive and ambitious projects I've seen in quite some time. I was on board with the premise itself, but when I saw the team's commitment to a strictly no generative AI workspace, I knew this was a project I could feel good showing to my audience. With that in mind, and considering the focus of this essay is all about creating more queer-led art, I hope you will check out the impressive work of this dedicated team and support them.
Have I been in combat before? Every day is combat.
The beautiful thing about art is that it is open to interpretation, often interpretations that the creator might not have expected or intended. So it is with queer characters in film, TV, and especially video games. And it shouldn't surprise you to know that people don't like it when you infer or say a character is queer, even as a joke. For example, we can look to a recent tweet of mine about Aya Brea, the protagonist of Parasite Eve 2, and absolutely nothing else. This tweet I made got me some flack on social media. I made a simple shitpost in a recognizable style, and people on the internet took it very seriously and even joked that I deserved to be beaten to death with hammers for joking around that this character might be queer. This behavior isn't new to me. Earlier this year, something very similar happened when I made another very obvious joke that people got mad about. You know what was similar between these two instances, though? Aside from the fact that both were throwaway jokes meant to make my audience chuckle and move on, that broke outside of my audience, leading overly serious online gamers to think I was seriously trying to steal their characters. Aside from that, the similarity between these two instances is that both of them had people agreeing with me. Not taking the jokes as a fact, of course, but agreeing with the spirit of the observation. Nobody was saying as a fact that these characters are canonically queer, yet a ton of queer people looked at them and said, yeah, that makes sense, or even that those characters were awakenings or goals for them. The people retorting to these shitposts saying, actually these characters are all canonically straight, didn't seem to notice that. And as a microcosm, I think that's a really good distillation of how characters appeal to different people in different ways. Take a look at the characters of Final Fantasy X-2, for example, an all-female party of J-pop inspired sky pirates with various different styles, and gameplay revolving around switching outfits mid-battle to grant different abilities. To many, presumably cis-male gamers, these are just returning characters and new game mechanics for a continuation of Final Fantasy X's story. But as the comments attested, several trans people and queer people felt a bit more attachment towards these characters. I can only speculate as to why, but I'd guess a story about a ragtag found family going on fantastical adventures together while using fashion and accessorizing as a key gameplay mechanic might be cathartic to someone who would have been in the closet in the early 2000s when the game came out, or simply anyone who was queer who didn't see themselves regularly in media. Here's the very simple distinction to be made when a character or piece of media is identified as appealing to queer people. It's not saying that a character or piece of media can't appeal to anyone else. It's saying that a certain group, in this case queer people, identify with or appreciate how an aspect of that media is handled. And that's okay, because art should affect people in different ways. I'll talk about it in a bit, but there is a reason why so many characters get claimed as queer when they're actually canonically straight. And it's not because they're being stolen or because of wokeness or whatever YouTube ragebait thumbnails want you to believe. It's because those characters and their experiences resonate more than, for example, the gray slop of gay representation often shoved into Disney movies for 2 seconds. Take, for example, Link in The Legend of Zelda. Link has always been a fairly androgynous character, even back to a feminine portrayal in a Japanese magazine in 1986. Link has never been an overly masculine character, from having a slight frame to pointed features to long hair. These are all tropes of the fantasy elf that have been a part of the fictional race forever. Elves are meant to be ethereal, beautiful, graceful creatures generally. Unless you're Bethesda, who just fucking hate elves apparently, god damn. However, Link's androgyny doesn't mean he's not a man, or in this case, an elf. Elfman. Elfman. Yet that likely hasn't stopped plenty of human men over the years as identifying with him on his various heroic quests. Here's a character that in many ways looks like them, being the hero. In many ways, Link has always been a blank slate of a character that anybody can imprint onto. He's famously been mostly mute, except for various grunts and yells that accompany his elvish lawn mowing business. And when Link dressed as a female character to sneak into an all-female village in Breath of the Wild, a lot of people saw that aspect of the game and how it was handled as a kind of positive queer representation. Not intentionally, of course, but the circumstances around it, even if unintentional, resonated with a queer experience. Here's a character who isn't scared to dress in other gender signifiers, who is complimented and who passes as a feminine person. While this is something many trans and queer people do regularly, it can also represent a bit of hopeful fantasy for someone still in the closet. Unsurprisingly, it made a lot of people mad that others might speculate on Link's gender identity or identify with how gender structures were represented here. And while I can't prove it, I have a theory that much of the genuine outrage at this stems less from queer representation than the threat these people might feel that something they specifically saw as for them is now being identified with by somebody else, a very hands-off-their-toys mentality. Often in media, wearing clothes of another gender can be depicted as something conflated with sexuality and sexual pleasure in a negative way, which plays into the long-debunked myth of autogynephilia, which gender criticals and TERFs love to keep alive to say that trans women only transition for sexual gratification. This is not true. So much media features queer or trans characters that are treated as perverted pariahs or defined by cross-dressing and usually very little else aside from being gross and weird. Obviously, this is not representative of most queer or gender non-conforming people. Yet, in Breath of the Wild, this isn't at all the case. Link seems comfortable wearing the Gerudo outfit, and it's never played for titillation. It simply accepts that clothing and presentation are fluid concepts for some people, which is something rarely seen in media and certainly not in such a passive and accepting way. And there's a broad variety of queer identities who seem to find a bit of positive representation in this, from people who call themselves twinks, femboys, or just effeminate men, to even transmasculine people and, as I've mentioned, trans women. Some of the same positive reception was felt in the Final Fantasy VII remake. Since the remake was announced, people waited with bated breath to see how they would do the Don Corneo sequence, which in the original involved Cloud dressing up as a woman to trick a local crime kingpin. When I played the game, I myself found a lot of validation in Cloud's nonchalant presentation of gender ambiguity, and like Gerudo Link, many other people found similar validation. Here's a character known for being strong and stoic, who puts up a masculine front of icy cool to keep others at bay, and he's still able to acknowledge that he looks good in a dress.
Cloud? Is that you? Oh my god, that makeup! And that dress!
Nailed it, I know, thank you. Moving on.
And when I say validation, I don't mean that seeing a character express gender nonconformity is some kind of affirmation that my gender identity is genuine. I already know that. No, here the term validation, I mean more in terms of validating that gender nonconformity isn't something disgusting or deviant or inherently even sexual. These visual depictions, even by cis straight men, are validating to queer people because they help normalize the aspects of queerness that have for so long been treated as taboo. Things that, for queer people, have long carried the potential for violent backlash, even when seen in public. There's this idea that gets floated by people who get mad at woke media that these fantasy worlds shouldn't represent real life. It's fluid, for example, in a world with elves and dwarves, including black people, isn't accurate, but then even creating a new world with people of color or diverse identities will get a similar backlash, so there's really no way to win. Either way, an accompanying refrain on these complaints is that games and media are for escapism. These folks essentially want to use these fictional worlds to escape from the actual world, to ignore the existence of people with different gender identities, cultures, skin colors, and generally anything that doesn't represent them.
Game designers aren't intent on making games fun anymore, and our escapism isn't escapism anymore.
The whole point of playing video games, in fact, they're not supposed to reflect the real world with all its tedious, mundane problems and restrictions. They're supposed to represent something higher, something better, something more fun. They're supposed to represent what we aspire to be, not what we're stuck with in our day-to-day lives. And the more you try to fuck with that, the more you lose sight of the very purpose of your industry.
This video really had no direction. I just wanted to complain about the fact that I can't experience escapism anymore, because developers don't want me to escape reality. We have to constantly have communist propaganda shoved down our throats.
I don't want to discuss the validity of that because it feels like a waste of time. But on that tangent, queer people do the same thing, except instead of using media to not see others, they may simply see themselves incidentally in media and take a bit of solace in that representation because there's not a lot of good, understanding media for queer people. Now, does that mean that Link or Cloud are trans or non-binary? No, not to me. Does it mean they're trans femme or trans masc or they're anything other than canonically straight characters? No. And in fact, I honestly wouldn't want them to be. I wouldn't want Square Enix to come out and explicitly label Cloud Strife as non-binary or gender fluid. These are established characters and it would feel like complete pandering. But that doesn't mean that as a queer person, I can't find the way their gender nonconformity is represented to be refreshing and identify with it on a personal level that a cis straight man just won't. I'm not surprised that cis straight men would be threatened or get mad by queer interpretations of art that to them has always felt representative. But it's really not that big of a deal, because the two things can coexist. Queer people can say, hey, I find this representation validating, and the straight people can say, hey, I identify with this character for whatever reason, because they're two entirely separate ways to interpret art. To me, that's a good thing. Good art should mean different things to different people. While I don't think good art should always set out to be divisive or transgressive and edgy, there's truth in the idea that good art isn't for everyone, because often the art can be imbued with specific ideas from its creator, ideas that aren't going to appeal to everyone. Which brings me to a brief discussion of the recent film I Saw the TV Glow. Spoilers ahead. In terms of queer art, the recently released I Saw the TV Glow is a fantastic example of this idea. Spoilers for a recently released movie to follow. For those who haven't seen it, I highly recommend it, whether you're queer or not, because unlike a lot of other gay or trans movies, it isn't necessarily about a queer love story or relationship. In fact, you can easily say it's not about being queer at all. If you look at the explicit story of the film, it's a surreal nightmare where someone comes to realize they're living in a fabricated reality. And when they realize this fact, they're faced with a choice to wake up from the reality to an uncertain and terrifying future, or to stay in the dream world and waste away to a husk, pleasing others yet never truly living to their fullest self. That's just a broad breakdown of the narrative beats, but what's implied between the lines of this search for identity and meaning is a journey that many trans and queer people have faced, a question of facing the uncertain future ahead of them by coming out, or simply burying that side of themselves away, keeping their head down and wasting their limited time in life. This subtext is so blatant at points that I can't really even call it subtext. This story is explicitly meant to capture these surreal feelings of dysphoria that so many trans people have, the detachment from who you are versus how you or others might see yourself. For people who have never struggled with dysphoria or their gender identity, they likely won't see between those lines, no matter how blatant the themes are. The feeling of losing days, months, or years in a haze, often feeling dissociated and detached from everything you do, dissociating and feeling as though you're watching your own life from behind a screen instead of in the driver's seat, and then noticing how those things change when you begin to transition, how you feel more hopeful about your future, less depressed to wake up every morning, more eager to go out and take part in life. These were just some of my personal takeaways when I saw the TV Glow, because they resonated with my experience as a trans person. For queer people of all stripes, it has become a deeply moving experience as a film. When I saw it, I wasn't even really vibing with it for the first half. It's well shot, well acted, but I do not care for the 90s teen indie aesthetic. I've never really been into the Life is Strange vibe. So that was an example of part of the art that wasn't made for me. Others like it, maybe even saw aspects of their own upbringings or teenage years in it, which is part of the point of including it, but I didn't. Yet still, the ending of the film hit me like a truck, and I have yet to see any trans person who's seen it say they haven't cried or at least gotten weepy. Because for so many of us, we don't get to see our stories told, and certainly not with this depth and honesty. There's a lot to be said about radical art and how queer people should make more of their own art. I saw the TV glow felt like a bounteous feast after being fed scraps for most of my life. And this kind of representation is explicit. Like the inverse of Gerudo, Link, or Cloud in a dress. I don't expect the characters to be canonically trans or queer because I identified with them for a few moments. And I don't expect cis people to be impacted as much by a movie like this, even when they understand it. That's not to say it's hard to parse as a film, it's very on the nose with its metaphors, but it's just not going to mean the same thing to somebody who has never seen themselves represented this way. This is the power of explicit representation, but usually queer people, and especially trans people, don't get positive explicit representation. At best in mainstream art, we get unconfirmed hints at representation. One of the best subtle readings of a character in recent memory was Spider-Gwen in the recent Across the Spider-Verse films. From the Protect Trans Kids sign above her door to the trans flag color palette of her world, and then her entire story revolving around her dad accepting her identity as Spider-Woman being easily read as a stand-in for a parent struggling and successfully accepting and reconnecting with their trans kid. It's touching and beautifully told, but it's also never explicitly stated that Gwen is actually trans. Her story is simply being used by viewers as a stand-in for experiences many trans and queer viewers will be familiar with. Like Link, she's become something of an unofficial queer icon, making another straight white character for the roster of popular queer representation. And this is representative of what's unfortunately a best-case scenario usually. Existing as a metaphor is one of the best things we can hope for up until now. Content warning for transphobia in media. More often than not, the representation queer people have received, while broadly improving over time, has been much less thoughtful, especially regarding trans characters. Growing up, many will remember Ace Ventura or Silence of the Lambs. For me, it was Woody Harrelson playing a prostitute in Anger Management, and the character Carmen in It's Always Sunny in Philadelphia. These are the images I grew up internalizing trans femininity as, something reserved for perverts and miscreants, social rejects and prostitutes. Not someone to be loved so much as something to be used, not a person so much as a prop for a gag to be ridiculed and never thought of again. Carmen in Always Sunny is particularly interesting. I'm going to talk about the first season of the show in 2005 like a middle-aged white woman excusing her father from saying the N-word and just say, Always Sunny is from a different time. Which is true culturally. It occupied a place in a growing internet boom of black comedy and edgy post-9/11 content that includes things I did love growing up. I grew up watching South Park. I actually just finished an Aqua Teen Hunger Force rewatch. The character of Carmen is mostly interesting against this backdrop, however, because she's not explicitly depicted as being disgusting. Mac is chided and embarrassed to be with her and is made fun of by his friends, but the comedy here isn't from a character being depicted as a grotesque monstrosity who doesn't pass. This was the MO of several other pieces of media at the time, including South Park, Aqua Teen Hunger Force, and this particularly awful run of Garth Ennis's Punisher. Just don't ask. And in the grand scheme of representation, Carmen has come to be appreciated far more by trans people, and I think a lot of that has to do with the contemporary media around her using depictions of transness and gender nonconformity to punch down on an already victimized group, but also because of the role she would play retroactively in Mac's coming out as gay. After a brief fling with Carmen, Mac would get several episodes and running gags dedicated to not so subtly hinting that he's a deeply closeted gay man. As a character, this arc is honestly phenomenal, and charting across more than 15 seasons of TV, it doesn't just show how an insecure, broken person who needs the validation of others can come to accept himself and be happy throwing off the chains of others' expectations, but also shows the growing maturity of the writing team without ever losing the same incredibly bleak edge that made the show engaging in the first place. Mac is good queer representation. But then, going back to those first episodes is still a wake-up to a time when calling a character a slur instead of a name is what passed for good representation. And even in this best-case scenario for trans women, she still never amounts to more than an interpretable stepping stone for somebody else's journey. Going back to plenty of TV shows from this era, and chances are there's a forgotten trans character in a one-off episode, usually depicted as a murderer or an exaggerated stereotype of a drug-addicted prostitute, and usually dying or being beaten by the end of the episode. In the last year alone, I watched Miami Vice and The Shield for the first time and saw both of these things. Same with rewatches of Justified and Psych. And I don't even identify as a trans woman. I'm non-binary. I don't identify as a woman. Yet for so long, these images would be what I thought of when I contemplated experimenting with my presentation. If I so much as thought of being the person I wanted to see myself as. And so, like many other people, I took solace in the scant positive representation I could find. And I say find because it wasn't explicitly queer representation that I found this haven in. One unsung example that appealed to me specifically has always been Frank West in Dead Rising. Based solely on how photographs are judged based on erotic content, the player can intuit by the gameplay systems that Frank is a heterosexual man. Yet that doesn't stop him from exploring his feminine side in the abandoned zombie film Mall of Willamette. As you traverse every store, you can wear several dresses and feminine outfits, and Frank even does a little dance as though he's looking in the mirror thinking, damn, I look pretty good actually. You might say it's being played for comedy, yet even Frank's audible reactions aren't those of disgust that he will let out when taking some pictures, but are more curious than anything else. He even says perfect when trying on a dress. Again, I bet some might say, well, this is meant to be played as comedy because they're playing it straight. You're not supposed to think that he looks good. But that's not what it meant to me as an incredibly suppressed teenager. Here's a large, somewhat oafish straight man. Frank has chest hair, broad shoulders, hairy legs. As a teen, I had none of these things. I was skinny, and I've never been able to grow much body hair. But seeing Frank, who looked like an everyman schlub, be able to express femininity, free of judgment or worry or ridicule, felt validating in a way. It was comforting. In an era of games with few feminine protagonists and even rarer character customization, to be able to use a game's own systems to express myself and find my own unique interpretation of that particular piece of art. It's what I call the Bugs Bunny effect, where Bugs Bunny, famously a character that uses dressing femininely to trick Elmer Fudd and others in the original cartoons, has over time been seen something like a gender-fluid icon. In more recent incarnations, the dressing as a stereotypical woman is still played for laughs, but not playing into the trap trope, which reinforces negative and disproven stereotypes that trans women only dress femininely to pass so they can trick men. Like Frank West, Bugs might be playing at comedy, but it's not cruel. It's not mocking the idea itself of gender nonconformity, or of simply not existing entirely within one gender stereotype or another, but instead takes the comedy from people's reactions to that gender nonconformity. Gender can be fun, it can be fluid, and these examples are two of the best that I can think of to show that, and they're examples that might not even come to mind when you think about queer and trans representation. I spoke about this kind of representation in my very first channel video, which was on non-binary representation and characters. Specifically, I brought it up relating to Sunset Overdrive being an example of how to do good gender fluid representation because it kind of just let you look and express yourself however you want and allowed you to be comfortable in the world that way. And for many people who played these games or watched these movie and TV shows, I bet they didn't even consider these interpretations of art. Because like with I Saw the TV Glow, they come from aspects of identity that they might not have any experience or connection to. The same people who say, why can't you just play the game? Why do you need to see yourself validated? Are very likely the same people who have passively had representation in games and media even if they didn't realize it for their entire life. Straight white men have been the default for so long in gaming and media as a whole, and even still have a massive market share in protagonists and character designs. Queer people, not so much. People of color, not so much. Even if characters are confirmed queer, there's very little work done that lets people identify with the character beyond that label. So when trans or queer people claim a character, it can be for several reasons. One is that seeing ourselves is rarely explicit, and when it is, it can often feel like hollow pandering. I'm talking about some Dumbledore-ass corporate pride retcon like Blizzard did with Tracer in Soldier 76 and Overwatch. Because when a company comes out and says, hey, Tracer is gay, that's neat, I guess, but nothing about those characters to me speaks to my experience of being queer, or other people I know. There's only so much you can do, in fairness, with an online multiplayer shooter, but having a game out for several years that included backstories, animated shorts, comics, and more, and then deciding to tell everyone, feels like a little bit of an afterthought to me. It feels backhanded. Representation that's been shoved into me to quota. That could just be me and my interpretation of the art, but most queer gamers or Overwatch fans I've known have felt the same way. If you don't, that's fine, but this is my video. On the other hand, I actually feel more of a connection to characters like Cloud or even Frank West as a non-binary person. These are straight characters, mostly male presenting, but the way their gender nonconformity is represented speaks more to my own personal experience. It creates for me an interpretation of an aspect of the art itself as queer, even if others don't see it that way. The same can be said of characters like Gwen in Spider-Verse and even begrudgingly Carmen in Always Sunny. But more often than not, it is the absence of these characters' explicit transness that allows us to fill that void, to find something to identify with. Even Carmen, who is explicitly trans, is played by a cis woman. We've been so bereft of legitimate representation, we've had to imprint ourselves onto things that are sometimes the opposite of how we see ourselves. Sometimes because the mirror image still has just a little piece of us staring back. That's how we've come to claim straight characters as queer icons, out of essentially desperation to be seen or heard and have our stories told. Recently, I've been playing Shin Megami Tensei 5 Vengeance, and I found a lot to love as a queer person about the Nahobino, the main character. Depicted as an effeminate male with form-fitting skin-tight wear, he's seen as a demon despite ostensibly trying to fight on the side of good, and is only in his most powerful form when he merges two personalities within him. There's a lot of queer interpretations there, and that's barely touching on the nature of the struggle in heaven and hell, themes of redemption, and more. But it's also just an interpretation. There's a contingent of people who would say that this media is meant for escapism, that to include things like queer identities or even asking for that is missing the point. I've seen Twitter posts and forums arguing that if you can't enjoy media without seeing yourself represented, then you're a pathetic snowflake. Now, obviously, this isn't everybody. Now, obviously, there are going to be some people who don't agree with that and still don't agree with me, but I want to address those because I feel like I'll get some arguments like that in the comments. I want to address this way of thinking. I'm not saying that every game needs trans or queer or gay representation. I'm not the arbiter of what is and isn't authentic queer representation to begin with. Plus, it's thinking like that that gives us hollow corporate gestures like Tracer getting a girlfriend in a spin-off Overwatch comic book. Like, if there's something we can learn from some of the worst films of the last few years, it's that no good art is made by committee or by filling quotas. And unfortunately, while queer representation becomes ever slightly more widespread, a lot of it kind of tastes like that. There are exceptions, of course, but how many more times do we need a 2-second clip of a gay kiss in a Disney movie that gets cut out for overseas release? It's not good representation for the people it represents. It only serves to fuel the fire of people who want to complain about DEI and wokeness being shoved into media, because in these cases, yeah, that's kind of what's happening. And when you get solid queer representation actually made by queer people, it gets benched, because for people who only care about the bottom line, it can be seen as dangerous. Despite being ostensibly done with the film, Disney still shelved Nimona, the film by She-Ra reboot head N.D. Stevenson, when the studio making it was shut down after the Fox acquisition. Netflix scooped it up, and it was an Academy Award nominee. It beat out the tepid dog water toy commercial trash Disney shoved out that year too, at least in terms of audience and critical reception. So these stories can and do have a wider appeal, but you can't rely on massive corporations to tell them. Like, when I think of the characters that are beloved by the queer community, the kissers in Lightyear or Rise of Skywalker or Josh Gad in that one unnecessary Disney reboot, you know the one, they don't even come close. Is it queer rep? Technically. But we don't claim them. It's like getting socks for Christmas. Like, on the most technical level, it's nice that someone gave you a gift, but you can easily recognize that no thought or effort was put into it. The saying with gifts is, it's the thought that counts, but what if there was no thought to count? It's actually similar to how I feel about pride flags in video games. It's nice that they're there, and I think that that background imagery can help to demystify and destigmatize queer existence, but putting a PNG file on a building isn't meaningful representation, no matter how much it might piss off performative YouTube rage bait dorks. I see more identifying with characters like Cloud and Link, characters that are broadly appreciated, but whose aforementioned ambiguities give them a specific appeal to trans people, femboys, and plenty of other identities. Or look at the jokes I made earlier about characters like those in Parasite Eve or Final Fantasy X-2, who queer people have likewise identified with for decades now for various reasons. To go back a few paragraphs, I'm not saying that I want all media to have trans or queer people, but I'm saying that often queer interpretations of a character or work can be entirely valid, even if it's not what the creator intended. One of my all-time favorite video essays was on RoboCop, interpreted as a trans narrative from Maggie Mae Fish. If you haven't seen it, I'll link it below. It's a quick watch, but a sterling example of what I'm talking about. Here's a classic movie I've seen a dozen times, but as a staple of now accepted 80s action movie canon, I've never even thought to apply this kind of lens to a story, even though thematically, it fits perfectly, as Maggie sums up. And that essay is a constant inspiration to take a piece of art, whether it's a game or a movie, and spin it around. Examine it from another angle. Maybe it's something you didn't like the first time or didn't appreciate before, but viewed as an allegory for something else, you might find more depth to it. So all of this is to say that not only are queer claiming and interpretations of characters that aren't explicitly queer valid, but they can be good for artistic exploration and interpretation. But at the end of the day, they aren't actually queer characters. Link and Cloud are queer icons, kind of like how Prince is a queer icon, not because they're queer themselves, but because of how queer people see themselves in a slight aspect of their depictions, a slight aspect, a fragment, a small piece of what should be a much bigger picture. A while back, I mentioned that we can't rely on big companies to tell these stories. They get sanded down, sanitized to the point of being unrecognizable. That doesn't mean these stories can't be popular or profitable. Korra, She-Ra, Owl House, and others, despite being often downplayed by their companies when representation is made explicit, have all managed to amass passionate fan bases of all ages. The Matrix, one of the last big blockbuster franchises of the 2000s before the Marvel Cinematic Apocalypse, is an explicitly trans narrative made by two trans women. Yet, because art and its myriad interpretations are malleable, it's a story that appeals to viewers the world over. But even these stories have concessions made. Owl House was canceled. She-Ra's merchandising dried up after the first season, and the rest of the show quietly went unreleased on DVD with very little promotion from its parent companies, despite 5 seasons being released and it being popular with viewers and critics. The trans allegory of The Matrix is centered around a straight white man, which allows for maximum mass appeal. And I think that's why so many people cried at I Saw the TV Glow. It was made by queer people for queer people, a trans film about a trans experience, not table scraps given by well-meaning cis straight guys or accidental allyship. And that's what we need more of right now. Another great example of this recently was Jesse Gender's Identities, a film on Nebula that explores the boundaries of identity and self-determination in a deeply personal, occasionally funny way. These are the kinds of stories we need more of, stories that color outside the lines of what we know or expect these narratives to look like. There are so many different experiences that can be captured in so many different ways across games, movies, shows, books, and more. And how often do we see the same stories and tropes playing out again and again with only slight changes to the formula each time? I want new stories from new perspectives. This isn't all to say I only want to see trans or only queer stories, but more stories from all perspectives. I love art and being able to interpret art, to see myself or even just the world around me through it, and to talk about it with others who have that same curiosity and can open my eyes to even more ways to see those things. But to get more art like that, you have to support more art like that. If you don't want to just keep settling for trans representation that's hand-me-downs and metaphors, or gay representation that ends with doomed romances or sassy best friends, you need to seek out and support the artists out there making things that go beyond those boundaries, that don't just rely on tropes, but experiences. Slowly but surely, queer art is getting there. It will never be mainstream in the way that term conjures images of the Marvel Cinematic Universe or Star Wars. But that doesn't mean it can't be successful. It doesn't mean that the only characters we can ever claim, or the only things we will see ourselves in, are just fractals of a larger picture. The characters we've come to claim make up an important part of how we've seen ourselves in art so far, and they're a wonderful way to reinterpret creativity and artistry, even when the creators of that art likely never intended for it to be seen that way. But they're still not a substitute for our own stories. And many of those stories have yet to be written. They're pieces of our stories that represent commonalities between us all. So as Pride Month ends, support queer art. Support minority art, not just the stories that speak to you, but the ones that speak to others as well. If you're trans, help to uplift the voices. If you're trans, help to uplift the voices of gay musicians, the lesbian filmmakers. If you're lesbian, help to uplift the local Black street artists, your underground film and music scenes. This essay has been about queer characters and the journey of how and why they often get claimed even when they're not queer. But view everything I've said from another angle. Reinterpret it through a different perspective, and these hints of recognition don't just apply to queer characters, but everyone. Everyone, at some point or another, has seen themselves in a small way represented in a piece of media, no matter how slight or insignificant. They've related to a character that otherwise had very little in common with them. But we all deserve more. We don't deserve fragments of our stories, but the whole story, proudly displayed on the screen. And to do that, we need to support each other. That's how we will make our own heroes. Hello everybody, and thank you for watching. Before getting to anything else, please be sure to check out Stardust and the Kickstarter mentioned at the start of the video and linked below, as they only have a short time left to meet their funding goal. This video essay was likely a bit more rambly and less political than usual, but it's been a minute since I really had something so passion-driven just fall onto the page like this one did, and if it's a little messy, that's okay. On the subject of queer art, I tried my best to feature and source footage from as many queer channels as I could find, so special thanks to Freya Ward, and be sure to go check out some of the channels I sourced in the video. With Pride Month over, I want to thank everyone who has helped to support my channel through the year. This has been an incredible journey, and I'm so lucky to be able to make these videos like this one for a living. If you'd like to help me keep making videos, be sure to check out the links down below to throw a couple bucks my way and join the fine people cruising across your screen right now. I have some bigger deep dive projects in the works now, as well as some fun smaller projects like a new entry in my shooter ranking series coming soon, so I hope you continue to enjoy it, and I'll see you all next time, and happy Pride.